All right. Thanks for joining us, as always, everyone. For those of you who don't know, my name is Alex Ford. I'm the Director of Global Programs of the Bay Area Council. This will be the third in a series of virtual forums that we're doing to kind of just keep track of the recovery in China, what they're doing to get businesses back to business, employees back to work, and what policies locally and nationally are helping make a difference. Joining us today is from Dezan Shira Associates, Kyle Freeman. Kyle is a partner at Dezan Shira, also part of their international advisory and the lead on their North America, specifically the United States business support team. We're going to talk about basically two broad topics. One kind of covering, again, economic recovery and generally, where China is now. And we're also going to follow that up with a little discussion about the status of the trade deal and the what's been happening for the phase one portion of that trade deal, which is something that Kyle knows a lot about. Thank you so much for making that part of the conversation today. As always, and if anybody has not joined this before, if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat box on Zoom. My colleague, Karina Salamatina, is going to help remind me as those come up. I'll be keeping track of them myself. If there's a lot of questions, she's going to just kind of send a few of them towards me. But for the most part, we haven't had that problem on this forum. So just, at any time, throw something in the chat box and I'll be sure to ask it. So with that said, let's get into this. Kyle, could you just do a self-intro and get us started with your PowerPoint?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first, thanks, Alex, for having me. As you mentioned, I think you did a pretty thorough introduction, but I'm a partner with Dezan Shira Associates. I lead our international business advisory team and also our U.S. client services desk in Asia. So we're a business advisory firm. We do legal compliance, tax and accounting compliance, things of that nature. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here to get the presentation started. All right. So today we're going to be talking about, is China getting back to business? I'm sure as all of you are aware, China experienced the epidemic probably before it was a pandemic, a little bit earlier than other countries. And so now China is slowly starting to get back to work. So Alex and I thought it would be a good time while all of you are at home to think about getting back to work and look at how China is actually getting back to work. So as Alex mentioned, what we're going to talk about today, first we're going to talk about the work closures and work resumption. So we'll go through the closures, what those were, and we'll look at work resumption and business activity. So work resumption being people getting back to work, getting back in the office, back in the factory, and business activity being our businesses functioning at the same capacity as they were before the outbreak in China. And then we'll briefly look at what is the economic outlook. So how has China recovered in the March and early April periods? And also what does the economic outlook look like for China during the rest of the year? In the second phase, as Alex mentioned, we're going to go over the US-China phase one trade deal. So this was signed in January and it became effective in the middle of February. So as all of this was happening, this kind of got put to the side a little bit. So we're going to look at what has happened, what are the obligations under the agreement, and have these been met amidst all that is going on. So before we do get started, I just wanted to note our firm does have a coronavirus resource page. So if you're interested in what's happening in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, and also across Southeast Asia, we do track these policies daily. So if you're looking for more coronavirus reading or more Asia-specific resources on coronavirus, you can check out our page here. We also do have a publication subsidiary, Asia Briefing, We have several flagship publications. So if you're looking for something not coronavirus related, but business related in Asia, you can check out our resources there as well. So those include online articles every day, monthly magazines, and also annual compliance guides.
And I can definitely make a plug for the Asia Briefing. Been reading it for 3 years now. It is pretty exhaustive, covers basically everything with regards to the economy, policies to take advantage of, industries that are succeeding, failing, and what's kind of going on with U.S. custodies in China. So it is a pretty helpful resource.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So work resumption and work closures. I think we'll start here and kind of explain what happened in China as far as businesses closing. So as I mentioned, before it was a pandemic, it was an epidemic in China. So this happened about late January, I should say, and early February. So just to briefly explain this graphic, in the top half of the graphic, we have the schedule of work resumptions or reopenings. And the bottom half of the graphic, we have kind of the totality of the closures. So I'm going to focus on the bottom half of the graphic first. The work closures, what we had is starting at the end of January, right before Chinese New Year, we had a growth in the numbers of the coronavirus or new coronavirus cases in China. So starting right before, as I said, Chinese New Year, there was basically a lockdown of Wuhan. So Wuhan and Hubei province, marked there in red, were the epicenter of the outbreak, as I'm sure most of you have seen. And that was put on lockdown and effectively on lockdown for 76 days. So just until recently, meaning no one could travel in or out of the city and effectively in or out of that province. That happened literally just the day before Chinese New Year. So to put that in context, Chinese New Year is equivalent of, let's say, the US Christmas holiday. So basically all businesses are closed and there's a lot of travel. Because of what was happening in China, basically travel was very limited during that period. So a lot of people did not travel as they normally would during the Chinese New Year period. So what happened in week one was everyone, just before we left for Chinese New Year, Wuhan was put on lockdown, and there were several other lockdown measures or business closure measures put in place. So the Wuhan lockdown was implemented from the central government, actually.
And to add some color to that, one of our colleagues, actually, Wang Xiaozan, was traveling back to Wuhan just a day before that lockdown started. Was stuck in Wuhan after that for about 60 days, and actually just returned to Beijing. Was definitely it was an intense month for sure. 2 months.
Yeah, I think about 2.5 months, and then I believe she probably also needed to meet certain requirements when she got back in Beijing. So we can talk about those a little bit later as well. So basically, there were several lockdowns and restricted travel during the Chinese New Year period. The Chinese New Year period is a 7-day holiday, so many of the businesses are already closed. What happened in week 2 is that actually the government extended the Chinese New Year period for an additional 3 days because of the epidemic prevention control measures. Following that extension, again, that was a central government policy. Local governments and city governments implemented work limitations the following week. So that's week 3 in our graphic at the bottom. And then week 4, 5, and 6, we have limited work resumption. And we'll go into how that was implemented. But again, those were local measures, so either provincial or city level measures. So just anecdotally, to give you an example, in February 10th, that is week 4 on the graphic. In Beijing, we were only allowed to start business in a limited fashion. However, our colleagues in Shanghai were able to open up the office to a larger extent. Beijing, just to put that in context, has probably had, amongst cities, has probably had the most restrictive policies, and a lot of those are still in place. So I'll mention about those or talk about those a little bit later.
And are we going to talk? Are we going to talk a little later about just kind of how distinct each of these regions' policies were? I think a lot of folks kind of think of the lockdown and how it was directed as being fairly central government oriented, when there's actually a pretty wide diversity of how the policies of how each province, each city kind of implemented policies for shelter at home or following up to get people back to work.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, I think we can talk about that now. So when we talk about the work resumption, we can see that the western provinces, to the left of our map, they resumed work a little bit earlier than other provinces. That's because they had less numbers as far as the outbreak, and they're also less densely populated. So to the eastern part of China, most cities resumed work around February 10th, and some cities or provinces did have special measures. So you'll see in the north, there's 2 areas that are in gray: to be notified or enterprises to adapt flexible work mechanisms. So that was Beijing and the neighboring city of Tianjin. Basically, to give some context to what you were talking about, Alex, the work resumption measures were very different across different provinces. So I'll take Beijing and Shanghai. So in Shanghai, our colleagues were able to go into the office starting in week 4, and there were no really work limitations. I'll talk about what epidemic control measures were still in place and are still in place, but generally they could go into the office and work as they previously had. They did have to wear masks, and we continue to have to wear a mask here. However, there were no really restrictions on them. They didn't need to have hand sanitizer. They did need to sanitize the office on a daily basis. Those are still requirements that are in place. But there were no limitations on going into the office or on numbers in the office. And actually, probably starting in March, travel restrictions between different provinces were largely lifted, so our colleagues in Shanghai could go to other provinces. In Beijing, it was quite different. So as I mentioned, Beijing is a bit more restrictive than other cities. So throughout week 4, 5, and 6 in Beijing, actually in week 4, we weren't necessarily allowed to come into our office building. That was because of a city policy that the office building needed to implement. In week 5, we started to come back into the office. However, because of the local regulations in Beijing, we were limited to having no more than 50% of our staff in the office at any given point. That was a Beijing policy, and that was actually in place until basically the end of March. So only as of 2 weeks ago were we allowed to resume full staff or full working capacity actually in the office. There are heavy travel restrictions also implemented in Beijing. So for instance, if I leave Beijing, I'm allowed to do so, and I'm allowed to travel to another province. However, when I come back to Beijing, even though I haven't left the country and I haven't gone into any high-risk health areas, I have to implement a 14-day stay-at-home policy or self-quarantine before I can go back into the office or before I can go back into public. So Beijing is actually one of the only places that still requires that. So the policies do vary quite a bit from province to province or office to, or city to city. And Beijing probably still has the most restrictive measures in place.
Thanks, Kyle.
So as companies were getting back to work, they were looking to get staff back in the office, but also looking to get back to business, as the title of this presentation mentions. So this is a pretty busy graphic here. Maybe I'll break it down a little bit. So this box in the bottom left-hand side of the corner, or the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, is the 3-week time period that we are looking at in our previous graphic. So that week 4, 5, and 6, I believe it was. Those are the 3 weeks represented right there, where we said there was limited work resumption.
So that's going from February 14 to March 13.
Yes, roughly February 14 to basically the beginning of March. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So at that point, there was limited work resumption, but our graphic here is not tracking work resumption, it's tracking business activity. So in the blue box up at the top, we have the current work resumption as of last Friday. So work resumption is actually people getting back to work. So Alex, you mentioned earlier that you had a colleague that could not get back to work because of travel restrictions and quarantine measures. So to some degree, these are still a local issue, and it's causing some friction and having people get back to work or resume work. But largely, we can see at the moment that China, as far as work resumption, is very close to about 100% work resumption. So this work resumption number that I quote here is actually a combination of the provincial reporting. So each province reports, I believe, weekly on its work resumption numbers. And basically most provinces have 100% work resumption numbers. However, I think what we really want to look at is not are people getting back to work, but are businesses getting back to normal? So on the top right-hand side, as of last Friday, we have the business activity indexes. This comes from a third party, so it's not government numbers. They use a number of metrics to look at this, various surveys, as well as the work resumption numbers, and other reporting statistics from the Chinese government. And so they've come up with an index of business activity. So these numbers at the top right-hand side of your screen are the numbers as of last Friday, so April 17th. So we can see that China is largely operating at about 80% capacity. So there's still 20% of business activity that is missing that was there before the outbreak in China. So it's broken down into various components. So we have the National Business Activity Index, and then we've broken it down into smaller enterprises and larger enterprises. So large enterprise activity and SME business activity. In the chart below, we can see it tracked over the past few months and up until last Friday. So the line on this chart is the national business activity, so tracking that. And then the bars on the chart break that down as far as large enterprise activity and SME activity. So if we look at that first initial period, there's very low business activity. As I mentioned earlier, most businesses were closed except for essential businesses. And it wasn't until basically that area in the box there that we saw businesses starting to get people back to work.
February 14, sorry for interrupting, Kyle. February 14, what is that in relation to when the new end of Chinese New Year was moved to? Was folks, for the most part, still not back to work past February 14, right?
Yeah, so let me flip back to the previous slide. So the new end of Chinese New Year was extended to 10 days. So it was from January 24 to basically February 2nd.
Right.
And then as we have here in week 3, that's February 3rd to February 10, we have limited work resumptions. As I mentioned earlier, actually in Beijing, we are not allowed to return to the office during that period. And in many cities or provinces, also people were not allowed to return to the office or return to their manufacturing sites. So it wasn't basically until about February 10 to February 14, that period, that people were allowed to start returning to work. So basically our graph here really picks up at when these measures were being lifted. So we can see at February 14, basically that was the low point. That was just the beginning of when people were allowed to resume work. If we look at the work resumption numbers at that point, they were quite low. I believe they were around 30 or 40%.
So the reason I bring it up is because we're coming up, at least here in the Bay Area, on our return to work date, which a comparable time it looks like from your previous timeline would have been that February 10 to February 16 point. But people were broadly still pretty slow, even though they had the ability, or there was not a policy preventing them from going to work, to actually get back to work. At least that's kind of my reading of this. Is that accurate? Were there a lot of were there still quite a significant number of policies preventing people from being back to work even February 21 or February 28, or does that reflect more of just the economy was recovering and people just were not able, there was not work for them to do, or it was an economic restriction, not a political restriction?
So I think it was both. So I've broken the chart down here into supply constraints and demand constraints. So our red line in the middle indicates everything to the left is supply constraints. So those supply constraints, one of the big issues was the supply of labor and getting businesses back open. And that's because there were very restrictive measures about reopening. So having people in the office or having people in a manufacturing site. And I'll go through kind of what those are in the next slide. But it was very difficult to reopen a business. In the background of this bar graph and this line graph, we're tracking another number there just for reference. So that gray area, the dark gray area to the left is the outbreak of coronavirus cases in China, and then the light gray area to the right of the chart is actually the outbreak of coronavirus cases in the US. So those are new daily cases. So we can see as China was looking to get back to work during this initial period, the numbers were still relatively high in China. You can see that there was a large spike even one day. That was because of data reporting issues. But yeah, there were still a large number of cases comparatively in China. And there were still heavy epidemic prevention measures. And so to reopen a business was quite difficult. As we can see, businesses slowly reopened. And so now China, as of basically the end of March, is functioning at about 80% capacity. But that 80% capacity, picking up that additional 20% is really going to be difficult. Probably starting from a very low base and getting up to 80% might have been one of the easier parts. Now China is facing a demand constraint. So that's suppressed consumption demand in China. So businesses are seeing consumer and retail numbers down quite a bit, and also suppressed consumption and industrial demand from overseas markets because of the outbreak in other countries, say as in the US or in Europe. And we can look at the trade numbers a little bit later. So you ask specifically about work resumption. So yes, there were work resumption constraints. One of the main issues here in the left box to the top is the red tape involved in opening a business. I probably can't properly put this in context.
Yeah, it'd be great if you do have a write-up of that we could circulate with folks, that they could kind of see just as examples of the kinds of barriers that were in place, knowing that they're different in every city.
Well, they were different in every city. So the way this was implemented is basically as with a lot of other Chinese policies, is there were national level directives, and those were pushed down to the provinces, and then there were provincial level directives, then there were city level directives, and then even within different development zones or districts of the cities, policies were different. Even building to building, I know the office building next to us had different policies than our office building. So this was really difficult. Basically, the policies were very restrictive for service companies or white collar workers. It was not nearly as restrictive as it was for manufacturing companies, trading companies, or blue collar workers. I'll give an example because during this period, we were heavily involved in working with local authorities to help our clients, especially manufacturing clients, reopen. And so it was very difficult. A number of them in development zones. The development zone or the export processing zone was responsible for the policies and actually permitting a business to reopen. So it wasn't as simple as saying this is the date of reopening. Actually, a business had to go through a local approval to be reopened, and they couldn't start business activity until they were approved. These approvals were prioritized, so larger scale enterprises were prioritized first, and also enterprises in specific industries, specifically in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, supply in areas where supplies were needed. These were prioritized to open first, and then other industries were basically made to wait until those other ones were approved and open.
And I know we're going to get into that later, but as an example, restaurants largely not open at all. Most entertainment still not open. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's true. Maybe I'll go to the example of opening a manufacturing site. So I'll give an example of one of our clients. To open their manufacturing site, they had to submit basically, I think it was about 80-page application to reopen the manufacturing site. This application included basically the work history and also the travel history of all their employees. They also had to come up with their own epidemic prevention measures. So that means that they had to ensure that all staff within the manufacturing facility had masks, and actually they had to ensure that the staff in that manufacturing facility changed their mask every 4 hours. They had to ensure temperature checks every, I believe, 4 hours as well for all employees. So when employees arrived on site, they had to have their temperature checked after they had worked for 4 hours. They had to have their temperature checked. They had to ensure proper distancing between employees within the manufacturing site. So for them, it was not an issue. However, for other industries such as consumer electronics and things of that nature, if I've ever been to a manufacturing site for this, people are huddled quite closely together. So across different industries, this caused different problems. In certain manufacturing facilities, say semiconductors and things like that, you don't have a lot of people on the factory or foundry floor, so that's not an issue. So it was really very different between different industries. Some of the other requirements that they had to put in place is they had to ensure daily reporting of their staff's travel. Also, there was a local app they had to download so that the travel of their staff could be tracked and reported to the local government. So the red tape here was quite burdensome, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. And I'm going to flip back to the previous slide. This is why we see such a disparity in the initial few weeks on the left-hand side of this chart, between large enterprises and small and medium-sized enterprises. One is that the large enterprises were prioritized to open and had the resources to reopen, but also the red tape and getting through that was really difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises. So in the example I was talking about with our client and helping them reopen, actually it was a 2.5-week process of submitting documents. So we submitted documents on their behalf and applied for reopening. The development zone required some amendments to that document. The review of that took about 3 or 4 days. Then we had to revise that document, submit again. They required, the review again took 3 or 4 days. And then they required some small amendments again. And so there was an additional 3 or 4 days of final negotiations.
That is.
And then when they were approved to reopen, they were only approved to reopen for 8 hours a day. Whereas previously they had worked 3 8-hour shifts per day, so they had operated on a 24-hour basis. For them, it was not necessarily an issue, but this was actually a large issue for certain manufacturing companies that require their machines to be on constantly. So when there's a large warm-up period for certain machines, or there's temperature requirements for certain machines, manufacturing companies that use these types of machines this reopening period and the hours limitations were very difficult for them. So finally, our client was able to reopen, and they were only able to work 8 hours a day. And that limitation was in place for about another 3 weeks, and then they got an additional 2 hours per day. Once
and
they
this is pretty reflective of what most businesses have been going through over the so you know, it's looking back at that prior chart and, you know, the resumption of work. You know, yes, part of that is coronavirus cases. Part of that is just the economy's not stabilizing yet, or has not bounced back. But a lot of that is also, I mean, a 2.5 week process to get people back to work. And at that point, only 1/3 of the workforce is actually going to be there. They used to run, you know, assuming they used to have 3 shifts at 8 hours, now they have 1. I mean, is that pretty reflective of kind of what this process has been for most businesses, at least in that sector?
Yeah, yeah. In the manufacturing and trade sector, I think that's correct. There were additional limitations because there were epidemic control measures in place. So traveling and logistics, there was really an issue. If businesses are closed, it's difficult to get input goods. But as far as logistics, there were road control measures, port control measures, things of this nature. So the logistics capacity was suppressed as well.
Hey, Kyle, just a quick question for you. Are you familiar with any employee testing requirements? I assume coronavirus testing requirements that the employees are responsible, or sorry, employers are responsible for?
Yeah. So actually, as I was mentioning, there's most employers are responsible for a temperature check. So this has just been relaxed a little bit in our office. And it varies again from place to place. But during that reopening period, our office, for instance, was required to do a daily temperature check of all of our employees.
But not an actual, like, not a coronavirus, whether it's like one of the antibody home test kits that I know are available there, or an RNA test. Actual coronavirus testing hasn't, to your limited knowledge, been an employer requirement?
No, it has not been an employer requirement. So I'll go over kind of how they've implemented this monitoring system, but there hasn't been an explicit testing requirement. It's more looking for symptoms, and if someone has symptoms, tracking them.
Okay. And just for everybody's reference, I know we are definitely going to go over time if we haven't already. And Kyle, I don't know if you're open to this, but maybe it might be worth taking the conversation about the phase 1 trade deal. And maybe just doing a part 2 to this conversation.
Yeah, let's see if we get there. And if not, I could run through that pretty quickly at the end. Another point I just briefly wanted to mention is the human resources. So there were travel restrictions, and it was very difficult to move between cities and provinces. For instance, a lot of our clients had employees that worked in one city but lived in another city. They actually couldn't go to work because they would be quarantined if they moved between cities or provinces. So that was another restriction as well, these human resource and travel restrictions. I'll try to quickly run through this. This is a survey from the American Chamber of Commerce in China, accelerating about basically the most helpful policies. I'll quickly go through the policies. I understand you had a previous presentation about 2 weeks ago about government support policies. But one of the most helpful policies or impactful policies that the government implemented, or local or provincial governments implemented, was accelerating these return to work approvals. Again, it was quite burdensome. And so being prioritized or being given a green light to reopen was really important for a lot of companies. And then also the third one there, relaxing quarantine restrictions on healthy workers. Again, you had healthy workers, but they weren't allowed to return to work because of certain travel or history requirements. Even some employees that were, say, had family in Hubei but had not traveled to Hubei where the epicenter was, they were not allowed to come back into work just because they had previously lived in that province. So it was very restrictive again.
Yeah, I remember, I mean, for a country with a very fluid transit, you know, and high-speed rail to every major city and a lot of cities in between, going from that to a point where you're, you know, almost completely unexpectedly unable to travel at all. caught a lot of people in places they had no expectation of being for a long period of time.
Yeah, it's really difficult to put how restrictive that was. I mean, I think you could describe it as it was efficient, so it worked in the epidemic control measures. But I think you could describe it as brutally efficient. It really suppressed travel and businesses as we are looking at. The programs, there's a lot of programs here. So in the US, I know there's a variation of programs, but the main centerpiece is the CARES Act, the appropriately named CARES Act. In China, there's a lot of different regulations at the national level and the local level, and it's been very confusing, I think, for businesses. So there's no central regulation that's dictating these support measures. So it's a little bit confusing. I want to highlight a few of these because there are some similarities to the US, but actually there's a lot of differences. So on the national level one, we have social insurance adjustments. So China has a state social insurance program, it's state healthcare and other insurance policies that is run by the national government. This a postponement of adjustments, basically every year, the city or province will update the minimum contribution requirements, and these go up about the minimum contribution requirements go up about 5 or 10%. So by postponing these and not having them implemented, usually starting in April, basically they're providing a 5 or 10% relief to these companies as far as their employment costs.
Do you have an idea of what kind of burden that would actually be for, I don't know, a medium-sized company? Dezan Shira is an example.
If I were to run the numbers, basically social insurance is anywhere from 30 to 40% of the employment cost of an individual employee. And if it rises 5 to 10%, if I'm running the numbers real quick, I think that would provide the companies an effective, let's say about 1.5 to 4% reduction in their overall employment cost by not raising this. So basically each year, a company's overall employment cost will go up about 1.5 to 4%.
Okay.
Because of this raise in the social insurance minimum. We also have a bank relending program. So this is getting liquidity into the banking system, and then the banks getting this money out to, specifically they're looking to target SMEs. There has been some friction in this program, and we don't know if the money is actually going where it needs to be. There are certain tax exemptions, filing extensions similar to in the U.S. And there's also a loss forward period extension. So that's also in the U.S. CARES Act as well. So in the U.S. CARES Act, they took the loss forward carry forward period and extended it from 20 years to indefinitely, I believe. In China, it's a little bit more restrictive. They extended it from 5 years to 8 years. Important to keep in mind that the Chinese regulations, there's a lot of them and they're very different. The US regulation, as far as the CARES Act, is a very central regulation. And actually, in essence, in its very nature, it's actually a tax bill. If you look at the cover of the US CARES Act, if you watch that press conference when Trump signs it, and you can see the cover there in some shots, it's actually a tax bill. It's amending a tax bill, believe it or not. On the local level, this is where we get a lot of subsidies and refunds in China. So there's certain employer refunds, so company refunds for social insurance. There's training subsidies. There's a reduction in rents or an extension in rent payment periods for certain companies. A lot of these programs are contingent upon the company basically still maintaining staffing levels, so not firing people. So if you fire employees during this economically difficult period, you will not qualify for these subsidies or for these refunds. So I think that's an important concept here as well.
This training subsidy, if I could just clue in on that real quick. I heard this one was particularly interesting. If I understood it correctly, any employer who pays for employee training during, I believe it was the period while they were stuck at home, but maybe this is still continuing, was eligible for 90 or 95% refund for the cost of that training. What was it's very interesting and it's helpful if you're an employer, but what was the purpose of that? Like, what were they trying to do with that policy?
Yeah, so the training policies, a lot of them were for kind of new workforce initiatives, so technology training, things of that nature. The requirements for the training or proving that you've done the trainings were still quite lax. So this was, I would qualify it really as a subsidy to companies. If you meet really minimal requirements, you could apply for this training subsidy. And basically you didn't really need to prove that you did these trainings. So yeah, some of them were for new technologies. Some of them were for health training. It really varied across cities. These were largely at the city level.
I get it. I thought it was interesting because I guess as an employer, you have a bunch of employees who you are being incentivized not to fire, but maybe you can't really do much with them right now. So I thought this was kind of an interesting way to, continue to help these employees provide value to a company, incentivize those employers not to fire them, again with another policy, and then at the end of this, you have a better trained workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the general idea of the policy. From what I've seen personally, a lot of companies have taken the training subsidy, but have not actually
done the training. Okay.
The training.
Nice idea, though.
Also, at the bottom of that box, I understand we're running out of time, but there's a public-private retail voucher. So to stimulate domestic consumption, especially in retail, provincial governments have been working with online retailers or brick-and-mortar retailers to subsidize retail vouchers to encourage people to basically giving them almost a gift card and getting them back out and spending. The effectiveness of this has varied. This is largely done at a city level, but it seems to be stimulating retail and specifically brick and mortar stores to some degree.
Gotcha.
Again, I just want to briefly emphasize how the epidemic control measures were in place and are still in place. So I've just kind of taken some shots here from my day-to-day experience. In your residential compound, when you leave or go in or out of a residential compound, you have a temperature check and you have a residential compound ID card. You can't get in and out of that compound without the ID card, and you have a temperature check. When you get on public transport, there's a infrared temperature check camera that you have to pass through. And if you don't, you will be denied or even detained. Here, there's the building entrance controls. This is from our building entrance. Again, there's a camera that's reading our temperatures, and it has facial recognition. I'm not sure how well it works with everyone wearing masks. And so we're monitored every time we enter or leave the building. There's also a city app we have to show every time we leave or enter the building. I've given you mine here. And so basically it says there that no abnormal conditions. So my travel history is what it's tracking. So yeah, that's used everywhere, not only office buildings, but retail buildings as well. And then office safety requirements, as I was mentioning before. In all of these conditions, in any public space, everyone has to wear a mask. So I understand that's being implemented in the Bay Area as of, I think, tomorrow. And then also in the office, we have to provide our staff with masks. So we have to provide them 5 masks a day so that we know they're wearing them in the office. And we have to have a sanitation station. So stations with hand sanitizer and soap provided for the employees. And that's just for a white collar office. Again, looking at the recovery a little bit, I mentioned that retail and industrial production haven't resumed to the same levels. So in gray, we have the January and February numbers. January and February data for China was combined because there was a difficulty in collecting data during the epidemic, but also I believe the authorities wanted to skew the numbers a little bit because the February numbers were just very bad. So we can see in February, retail trade was down about 20%. In March, it's still down about 15%. Comparatively, industrial production was down about 25% in February, but it has almost resumed to full capacity now. International trade.
And sorry, this is recent as of?
This is March data, so it was actually published last Friday, but the data is recent up to the end of March.
Okay.
And then imports and exports, we can see they're still down. Again, we mentioned that's probably suppressed overseas demand.
Gotcha.
And then the China economic outlook. These are numbers from the Asian Development Bank. So the Asian Development Bank expects that China will grow about 2.3% compared to, say, Southeast Asia, which will have about a 1% growth rate this year. If we look at the Q1 numbers for China, again, these just came out last Friday. The Chinese, this is quarterly GDP growth. So for the first quarter, that's January, February, March, year on year, the Chinese economy shrunk by 6.8%. So that's a significant drop off. If you look at the report from the Asian Development Bank, those numbers, they expect a rebound in Q3 and Q4 of this year, which will drive up the growth rate to about 2.3% for the year. If we look at other reports, the IMF only expects about a 1% growth rate for China this year. However, they expect about a 9% growth rate next year, whereas the Asian Development Bank expects about 2% for China this year and about 7% for China next year. So they don't see as large of a swing. Comparatively, we're expecting, say, potentially negative growth in the US and Europe this year. So China might be one of the only large economies that we might see actually positive growth for the year.
All right, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks for spending, an hour with us, a little more than we expected. It's hard. We always find this so interesting. It's always hard to stop. All right, everybody, stay healthy. Enjoy the rest of your evening.